Right. Hello and good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the RCN's Beyond Broadmoor event. Thank you all for coming. My name is Carlos Holder, and I'll be supporting our guest speakers this evening and yourselves through the evening. So this event is quite poignant given tomorrow is World Mental Health Day, I think. So it's really good that you all were able to come out this evening and support that. So, as I said, my name is Carlos Holder. I'm a committee member of the Nursing Injustice and Forensic Healthcare Forum. And I'm a registered nurse. I've been a registered nurse for a couple of decades. So the event is part of the Library of the Museum exhibition series, Prison Nursing Unlocked, which is curated in partnership with the Justice and Forensic History of Nursing Forums. The event will be dealing with themes of mental health in secure settings. This might include some reference to violence, self-injury, and some other distressing topics, just as a little warning for you. Just from a housekeeping perspective, there are no planned fire alarm tests. So if the alarm does sound, please exit the building through the nearest fire exits that are identified. So the muster point for the inside is inside Cavendish Square, so out the front and in the middle of the square. Toilets are through the doors to your left. Well, your left, my right. And the event, as you can see, is supported by BSL interpreters. Please feel free to move closer to the front to get a better view of the interpreter if you need to. So, like I said, it's really great that so many of you were able to come out this evening and support this event. I just wondered, just for my own interest, by a show of hands, who's a nurse in the audience? Brilliant, brilliant, thank you. So we're here this evening to talk about the history of Broadmoor, Broadmoor High Security Hospital, and like I said, the event is part of the Nursing Unlocked series, and our esteemed guest speakers will take you through a sort of interesting and wonderful journey through the history of psychiatric services, secure psychiatric services. And obviously the aim is to promote a wide understanding of the history. I was talking to Chris, one of our speakers, earlier, and we were lamenting the sort of loss of the chronological history, the memory of nursing and the history over the years. So this is a really good opportunity, I think, for us to resuscitate that somewhat. So tonight's program explores the historical and the contemporary landscape of secure hospitals, with some reflections on how institutions have been shaped over the years by nursing practice, by policy, and how society's attitudes might have contributed to that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first guest speaker, who is Dr. Jade Shepherd. Now, Jade is a historian of modern Britain and specializes in the history of medicine, crime, and family. Jade's research associate, on the project Caring Communities, Rethinking Children's Social Care, 1800 to present. And this is a study that's originated in Newcastle University. Jade's presented research at several national and international conferences, and has frequently reviewed works in journals and is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So without further ado, put your hands together and let's welcome Jade.
Thank you, Carlos. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, lovely. Okay, hi. Thank you so much, RCN, for the invitation to speak. As Carlos said, I am Jade Shepherd. I wrote my PhD thesis on the crimes, trials and treatment of men who were sent to Broadmoor in the 19th century. And I published a few academic articles on the institution and its patients. I've also taught about its history and those who lived and worked inside its walls. And tonight I'm going to talk about the history of Broadmoor and the treatment of its patients over the second half of the 19th century, and I'll very briefly touch upon the 20th century. I am going to use some words or phrases that are outdated today, such as criminal lunatic, and this is how Broadmoor's patients were referred to in the 19th century. Let's see if this works. Okay, so Broadmoor Hospital, or Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, as it was known in the 19th century, was England and Wales's first such asylum. Its opening followed decades of debate about what to do with criminal lunatics, or people who had committed a crime because of mental illness. Should they be punished for their crimes or treated for their illness? And this was the key question that was asked at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, the consensus, particularly in medical circles, was that their illness should be treated and they should not be punished. In 1807, a select committee stood in the House of Commons and first recommended that a specialist criminal asylum be built. But progress was very slow. And in 1814, instead of this separate institution that people wanted to see, criminal wards were built at Bethlem. And in 1849, these wards were full, and a detached ward for criminal lunatics was built at Fisherton House Asylum in Salisbury. Criminal lunatics were also housed in prisons and in ordinary asylums as well. So criminal lunatics were placed alongside sane prisoners and the ordinary insane, and this caused a little bit of concern. And Bethlem in particular came under attack. It was overcrowded, no attempt at treatment could be made, and there were some worries about the association of ordinary lunatics with criminal lunatics. 19th century psychiatrists worried that the cheerless and wretched condition of Bethlem meant that treatment was impossible, and one referred to the institution as one of the most gloomy abodes to be found in the metropolis, a receptacle into which the waifs of the criminal law are swept out of sight and out of mind. And this isn't what they wanted. What they wanted was a criminal asylum like that which existed in Dundrum, in Ireland, which opened in 1850. And at Dundrum, patients were surrounded by acres of land, they worked at their trade, and they were provided with various amusements and activities. And psychiatrists saw this as an ideal institution. It was, as it says on the slide, a place where a happy valley is formed to make loss of liberty not irksome, but delightful. And at Dundrum, patients were treated with moral treatment. And moral treatment is how the mentally ill were treated at all Victorian asylums post-1845 in England and Wales. And under moral treatment, it was believed that all patients, criminal or not, should and could be treated. So it was crucial that patients weren't left to dwell on their condition or their incarceration, but that they were occupied with recreational activities such as reading, painting, playing cards, and other indoor and outdoor games, that they might be working at their trade or learning one, that they might be undertaking or taking part in some religious and secular education. Fresh air and exercise were also important, and so-called moral architecture played an important role. So asylums were designed to resemble large country houses with landscaped gardens. They had ornamental drives, parkland, farms, cricket fields, and estate walls. And they also had airing courts attached to each accommodation block, which allowed patients to get outside, but also to view the vast countryside around them. Mechanical restraint and seclusion were frowned upon. So patients were to be treated with kindness and patience, and the importance of friendly staff was emphasised. So over the course of the 19th century and into the 1850s, there was discussion in medical circles, in the press, in Parliament, about the need for a separate criminal asylum in England. Now, most people did agree with the idea, believing that a separate institution was required to meet the needs of criminal lunatics who, as a group, were allegedly more violent and loud than ordinary prisoners or the ordinary insane. Now, the government always pushed back, primarily because of how much it was going to cost. But the 1840s and the 1850s saw an increasing number of insanity verdicts and therefore a rising population of criminal lunatics. And by 1856, both the Bethlem and Fisherton House criminal wards were full, and in 1857, the government finally announced plans to build Broadmoor, which then opened in 1863. And the first female patients arrived that year, and the men followed in 1864. And on opening, there were roughly 100 women and 100 men at the institution. So there were two classes of patient at the asylum. First, there were those who had been found insane before or during their trials, who were known as Queen's Pleasure patients. And second, there were insane convicts. So there were those who had gone insane while they were in prison and who were then transferred to Broadmoor, either until their prison sentence expired, at which point they'd be discharged to another asylum or released, or until they were declared sane, at which point they would go back to prison until their sentences expired. 61% of women and 48% of men who were sent to Broadmoor between 1863 and 1900 were Queen's Pleasure patients, and 36% of women and 51% of men were insane convicts. And patients had committed crimes that ranged from duck theft to murder, and the majority of them were working class. So Broadmoor was built on the summit of a high ridge among the Berkshire pine woods, about 12 miles from Reading. And the Times newspaper described Broadmoor's buildings as lofty and handsome. It said a warmer and more comfortable looking structure was never erected in a more wild, though beautiful situation. Like most asylums, Broadmoor was self-contained, and there was a large central building, and there were male and female divisions. The male division had several accommodation blocks, and the women's division initially had one, and you can just see part of it there. A second block for women did open a few years later. Now, Broadmoor also had its own kitchen, a coal yard, a bakery, a farm, and workshops for the male patients to work in. And the superintendent's house was in the middle of the men's and women's divisions, which allowed him easy access to all blocks. Now, a couple of the blocks are noteworthy. So in addition to the separation of men and women, there was also segregation within the male division. So block 1, which is quite poorly illustrated on the left-hand side of that slide, that was home to the most violent and disruptive patients, and block 2 was home to the educated and the middle and the upper classes. And in the 1880s, a block specifically for male insane convicts also opened. Now, how the blocks looked was important because if appropriately designed, an asylum's interior was deemed conducive to recovery. Now, generally, and particularly in its early years, Broadmoor's blocks were bright, they were airy, they were cheerful, they didn't suggest custody or confinement. So there was artwork, there were plants, and there were no bars on the windows, and patients could just look out over the beautiful countryside. Now, each of the blocks was clearly split up with day rooms where patients could engage in recreational activities. So a bit like on the slide, you've got the accommodation blocks down the side, and the day room is like the big room at the bottom there. Now, sleeping-wise, there was a mixture of single rooms and dormitories. So that's very roughly what Broadmoor looked like. Now, when it came to moral treatment, religious and secular teaching were both considered important, primarily because of the perceived benefits of submitting to the discipline of a class, which was believed to foster self-control and prevent patients from dwelling on their illness or their incarceration. And religion was also believed to have moral benefits as well. Now, Church of England services were standard, but other religions were catered for. So there were weekly Roman Catholic and Wesleyan services, and a small chapel for Roman Catholic services was eventually provided, and a rabbi also visited the asylum. Now, in terms of secular teaching, patients were taught to read and write, and a schoolmaster was employed for the purpose. As part of treatment, some patients worked, so both men and women worked in the asylum laundry, more men than women were employed in the kitchens, and only men could work outside, so for instance in the asylum's gardens or on the farm, and women might be found doing some needlework. Male patients were encouraged to work at their trade if they had one, but if they didn't, then they could learn one. So the asylum had its own shoemaker, tailor, carpenter, bricklayer, and they could all learn from them if they wanted to. Initially, patients were paid with some extra beer and a bit more meat and cheese at dinner time. But this changed in the 1870s when patients were instead paid with a little bit of money, which actually went down terribly with some patients. In terms of leisure, reading was found to be one of the easiest ways to divert patients' minds, and the chaplain would travel to London's bookshops to purchase books for the asylum library. And patients could make specific requests, either for books to be delivered to them from the library after they had been purchased, or for books to be purchased or borrowed for them from outside of the asylum. Some patients also enjoyed writing, so some wrote letters home to their friends and families, others wrote essays on politics, some wrote Latin transcriptions. One patient, William Minor, he wrote entries for the Oxford English Dictionary while he was a patient. Other activities included singing classes. Some patients were taught how to play instruments, and many joined the asylum band. And the band, as well as theatrical entertainments, were put on for patients as part of treatment. And by around 1871, about 160 men and 50 women were assembling in the recreation hall to enjoy the entertainments that were put on primarily by Broadmoor staff. Now, Broadmoor's budget for entertainment was increased eventually, and outside performers were employed. Patients might also have played cards, dominoes, billiards, chess, cribbage, and backgammon. Art was also a favourite pastime of some, and the artist Richard Dadd was a patient at the asylum, having been transferred from Bethlehem, and he was given a single room to use as an art studio. And he painted lots of things, including this portrait of one of the medical superintendents, William Orange. Orange actually told a journalist that because Dadd didn't have to worry about selling his work, because he was in an institution, he could just take his time over it, and he could just use it as an exercise to help divert his mind away from his troubles. And Dadd also taught other patients how to paint as well. So patients were also encouraged to get outside and to reap the benefits of fresh air and exercise. And on this slide, you can see an illustration of male patients at the top, and they're playing croquet. And there are female patients at the bottom there, and they are dancing to the asylum band in one of the airing courts. Now, by 1871, Broadmoor had expanded quite a lot, and it covered about 320 acres, and it had paths and roads equaling about 8 miles, which enabled lots of space for walking. And Broadmoor's female patients could also take drives into the countryside. Now, in theory, it was hoped that all of those activities, working, indoor and outdoor recreation, attending religious and secular classes, would alleviate mental anxiety. Now, over the course of the 19th century, treatment for some patients did change. So, for instance, upon opening, all male patients, regardless of how they ended up at the asylum, whether it was via the courtroom or from prison, they were housed together, and they were treated in exactly the same way. But to Broadmoor's staff, treating these patients alike appeared to be a mistake. Insane convicts were reportedly more disruptive, they were more violent, and they were just not responsive to treatment. And eventually, Queen's Pleasure patients and insane convicts were separated. And this did lead to some accusations of favouritism from insane convicts who felt that they were looked down upon. And they were, I think, by some patients and by staff as well. And there certainly appears to have been a hierarchy, or several hierarchies, in the asylum, which affected how patients perceived their treatment and one another. With staff changes also came regime changes. So Broadmoor's final Victorian superintendent had lots of experience in prisons, and some complained that his regime was a bit more prison-like and tough, with instances of seclusion rising rapidly under his tenure. Although there is evidence to suggest that it wasn't actually that bad. Moral treatment did persist for many, and some patients did continue to write positively about their time at Broadmoor under his charge. So the treatment of patients was obviously dependent upon the asylum's staff, and Broadmoor required a lot of staff to keep running. So I'm going to focus on the medical and the nursing staff. Broadmoor had 4 medical superintendents, and it was the superintendent's job to classify patients. So he would examine them on arrival, he would make daily visits to all parts of the asylum, as well as random night visits. He kept records on all patients and on their condition, and he would inspect all of patients' incoming and outgoing letters. And on this slide, I don't know if you can see, but in the middle, he's got a big top hat on, and he's got a white moustache and beard. That is Superintendent William Orange, looking a little bit older than he was when Richard Dadd painted him. And to the left-hand side, or to his left-hand side as we can see it, with the big moustache, that is David Nicholson, and he succeeded Orange as superintendent. Now, under the superintendent, there was a deputy medical superintendent and an assistant medical officer, and there was also a matron in the female division. So the matron oversaw the female attendants who were responsible for the day-to-day care of patients. And there were many male and female attendants. Attendants were effectively nursing staff, but they didn't have medical backgrounds. Some male attendants were retired soldiers, or they had worked in the prison service. And you can see some of the male attendants on this slide. So right on the left there are some, and it looks like they're wearing padded coats. And they're wearing padded jackets, and they worked in Block 1, which is where all the violent patients were. Now, the attendants had a working class background. As a profession, being an asylum attendant paid a little bit more than other typical working class professions, so it wasn't a terrible route to take, and there was some space for career development, in that you could go from being an assistant attendant to a principal attendant, seeing an increase in your wages. In addition to their wages, attendants could live rent-free on the asylum's estate, and they received medical care from the asylum's medical officer. If they needed financial assistance, there was also a fund to help them. But being an asylum attendant was real hard work. The shifts were really long and it wasn't always easy. The superintendent and other proponents of moral treatment made it very, very clear that successful treatment lay firmly on attendants' shoulders, of them being of good character and well-behaved. And job adverts, there's a job advert on the bottom of that slide, you can't really read it very well, but they made very clear that if you want to work at Broadmoor, if you're going to apply for this job, you need to have a good character. And it says that explicitly on there, must be a good character, or do not apply. Broadmoor's rules also made this very clear. They highlighted kindness and forbearance are the first principles in the care and management of persons of unsound mind. Few such persons are beyond their influence. So there was loads of pressure placed on attendants. They were responsible for patients' safety, and they had to report all accidents, injuries, bad language, violence, threats, and idleness to the medical officer. They washed and clothed patients who couldn't do so themselves. They shaved the male patients, and they circulated reading materials and introduced games. They were also encouraged to form the asylum band and provide other entertainments for patients as well. But in addition, much like the patients that they cared for, attendants were expected to act in certain ways, and their behaviour was monitored. And attempts were made to improve that behaviour and their character. So a library and a reading room were established to help teach attendants morality and religion, and to help counteract the moral harm that had been caused to them because they worked in a criminal lunatic asylum. In addition, a regular dance was held and penny readings, where you'd pay a penny and go and listen to a reading or some other entertainment, were established. And a savings scheme was also set up to encourage staff to provide for their families. Now, despite such provisions, recruiting and retaining staff was sometimes difficult. So initially, staff turnover was quite high, so it was about 50% annually during the 1860s. Some attendants left of their own accord, so some women left to get married, and others just didn't like the work. But many were dismissed because they were unsuited to the work. So they were reportedly physically and verbally abusive to the patients, they were drunk at work, they lied, they slept on duty, they might have used bad language to a patient, or they might have helped a patient to escape. Now, moral treatment emphasised positive staff-patient relationships, and for some patients, the friendship and the support of the attendants made a difference to their asylum experience, especially if they had no contact with the outside world. But not all relationships were cordial. So attendants were employed to help and guide patients, but they couldn't force them to respond to them or like them. Some middle and upper class patients didn't like being told what to do by working class attendants, and many attendants reported being verbally abused or attacked with fists, bowls, plates, teacups and bars of soap. And as well, each Victorian medical superintendent was at one time or more attacked by a patient. So there was little emphasis on staff training and professional qualifications in asylums before the final years of the 19th century. In the mid-1880s, the Handbook for the Instruction of Attendants of the Insane was first published. It provided information about bodies and minds to help attendants look after patients. In 1891, the training scheme of the Medico-Psychological Association began the examination for the Certificate of Proficiency in Nursing, and many asylums, including Broadmoor, encouraged attendants to take it. So very slowly, the field of asylum nursing began taking steps towards professionalisation, and this continued throughout the 19th century, which is just what I'm briefly going to finish on. And there was a lot on that slide, I'm very sorry. So today, Broadmoor is one of 3 high-security hospitals in England. But what has changed? Now, I don't know a lot, but from what I do know, everything and yet not much. Now, the changing socio-political climate of the 20th century affected life at the hospital. Now, Broadmoor has never been a prison, and it never will be. But in the 1950s and in the 1960s, there was a distinct military feel to the hospital, and staff would salute each other in the corridors. There was also less greenery, and asphalted airing courts started to dominate the landscape. So Victorian Broadmoor has lots of green space. This slowly ebbed away in the 20th century. Patients' movements around the hospital were increasingly restricted, and bars were put on the windows and rooms started to be locked. Electroconvulsive therapy was introduced in the 40s, and in the 60s, the use of drugs was increased, which is not different to what is happening at other hospitals. And the title of attendant was changed to nurse, and staff were now expected to pass the nursing examination. Now, following the Second World War, and because of advances in medicine, the environment, so fresh air and exercise, was no longer a key part of treatment. And in the 70s and 80s, increasing concerns about trade practices and the use of cheap labour and the exploitation of patients put an end to patients working in the kitchen and in the stores. And in the late 80s and early 90s, drama therapy was used, and actors from the Royal Shakespeare Company, including Sir Ian McKellen, who is on the slide, performed Shakespearean tragedies at the hospital. And Broadmoor also changed shape. So the height of its perimeter wall, which had started off quite low, fluctuated in line with the perceived danger that patients posed at any given time, and with different superintendents. And the institution saw research and staff education centres built, a qualified librarian and teachers were hired, and the chaplain assumed a less senior role. And the patient population has changed as well. So by the end of September 2007, no women remained at the hospital, and now only men who are over the age of 18 and from London in the south are sent there. And in December 2019, the new Broadmoor opened. Now, obviously, I've got no idea what happens inside its walls, but based on its website, the old Victorian buildings are no longer fit for purpose. They were considered unsuitable for treating patients, and they posed risks for staff safety, which is at complete odds to how they were conceptualised by the Victorians. And there also seems to be a renewed emphasis on green space, on bright and airy spaces and amusements, and on friendly staff-patient relationships as well. So it's not too dissimilar to when it first opened. Okay, that's a very rough history of Broadmoor. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Jade. So next, we've got Chris Hart. Chris is an independent nurse consultant specialising in mental health. Previously was a consultant nurse in forensic and intensive care nursing at South West London and St George's Mental Health NHS Trust, and a principal lecturer at Kingston and St George's University of London. Chris has written extensively on the history of trade unions and industrial action in nursing. Put our hands together for Chris. Thanks.
Thank you. Because I knew Jade was going to cover some of the things in Broadmoor's history in terms of attendance, we're going to go outside it. We are going to go beyond Broadmoor, and we're going to whiz through 150 years of history in 20 minutes, so hang on to your seats. And we're going to end up in prison because in this country now, the vast majority of people with severe mental illness are not in secure hospitals, they're in prisons. And we need to think about how that has happened. So we start with the fact that actually nurses have always been invisible. And that's true historically. Everybody would think, well, hang on, I know about Florence Nightingale. Most people now will have heard of Mary Seacole. But if I asked a large group of nurses who was Edith Cavell, most of them wouldn't know, and they would struggle to name half a dozen nurses from our history. In policy terms, nurses are pretty much absent. So if you look at all the major policy texts that have been written in the last 50 years, you'll see very little reference to nursing or nurses. And politically, they sit outside of the policy-making triangle of civil servants, politicians, and the medical profession who determine the shape of healthcare. So it's difficult when you kind of begin to think about what life must have been like 150 years ago. But one of the issues that arose out of the structure of Broadmoor and of the asylums themselves is that the purpose of them was to remove and isolate society's most problematic individuals. The difference for Broadmoor, as Jade was saying, is that that was for the criminally insane. But actually, the isolation and the removal principle was true of everybody who was sent to an asylum. And if you look at the asylums that were built around London, they were all in rural areas. There were very, very, very few in any of the major urban centres. So the attendants working inside them were equally isolated and removed. The treatment, as Jade was saying, focused on moral treatment. There were limited options in terms of sedatives and stimulants that could be given. For a lot of the working class people who would come into Broadmoor, actually having a roof over your head, regular meals, however bland the food was, plenty of fresh air, and the communal activities that they were able to participate in was probably a big advance on what they experienced in their life before they came into the asylum. But there was this belief that by neutralising the environment and taking people away from where they had become, in the words of the language of the time, insane, that this would be beneficial. And the word asylum was about protection or safety, being taken to a protected and safe place. The moral treatment, as Jade has said, was about a regime that looked at different aspects of life. And it originated in France under the work of a doctor called Philippe Pinel. And he worked at a place called the Salpêtrière Hospital. And there was a mirror to that in York, a hospital called the Retreat. So when we look at those, we'll come back to those in a minute, we'll look at how moral treatment evolved and the notion of moral treatment evolved and who was crucial to it. But the asylum attendants who never were are those who were working in Broadmoor and other asylums throughout the country. Jade's one of the few people who, in making any reference to the history of the institution, talks about attendance. So Mark Stevens' very good book written about Broadmoor and its history, and in an hour-long podcast, the only reference he makes to asylum attendants were their shaving and washing of patients, because actually shaving people was quite difficult. You'd have two attendants, one doing the shaving, one watching the person to make sure that was safe, feeding them, keeping a check on all the cutlery, as would happen now, getting assaulted. But again, no mention of any asylum attendants getting assaulted, whereas each of the superintendents who were assaulted, you'll find great detail about the attack on them. And getting sacked. That was a big thing, as Jade has said. And they would, for all the reasons that she noted. Just, sorry, out of interest, this photograph. Oh, hang on, sorry. This photograph, which was taken in 1935, I think, shows patients being bathed in a communal area. What's not shown in this photograph is that there would have been hoses on the other side of where that photograph is taken, and it was quite common practice for the attendants to hose patients as a group because it was quicker than washing them individually, and they wouldn't necessarily have had the time to do it. So, and there were still nurses I worked with when I started my training who'd done that kind of work. So we're not going back enormously in our history to see what we would probably think of as fairly barbaric practices. But from the Stafford Mental Hospital Handbook, we can see again what Jade was talking about the need to devote oneself as an attendant to the work, to be ever present, to be kind, and the whole time to be devoted to the patients, and they're to be constantly with them. So this is for 10, 14 hours a day. They are not to sit in their rooms except at meal times and when off duty, and are expected to amuse and employ the patients in every way in their power. So the attendants, these are not from Broadmoor, these are from Leavesden Hospital. They usually worked a 12 to 14-hour shift, and that would be spent entirely with the patients. The kind of work they were doing is not that different from what nurses would do now, actually. They would be supervising their work, and the theory when the asylums opened, as with Broadmoor, was that moral treatment and kindness would cure the patients. Of course, they very quickly found out that didn't happen. And what was happening was that the asylums were filling up, patients weren't being discharged, and the costs were growing up exponentially. So the need for asylums to become self-sufficient financially was a priority. So it would happen that you might be taken into an asylum and not discharged because you were a good worker. And that was not uncommon, because the need to produce on the farm, in any of the activities where employment could be used, became very important. Nurses, the attendants would supervise that. They would look after personal hygiene. They would take part in activities. But there was another side to it, which was where, I think Jade made reference to this, they would take part in entertainment. They would put on opera for the patients. They would put on all kinds of activities for them. They would participate in sports and train them in sports. But they would also have to do cleaning and other activities that were essential to the running of the asylum. There weren't what were called for a while domestics and then later became cleaners. It would be the attendant's job to do all of that. In Broadmoor, many of them had worked in the prison service or had been in the military, but generally asylum attendants were previously unemployed. It was the lowest paid work in many parts of the country. Conditions of service were very poor. If you think back to the Stafford Handbook in 1927, just a couple of years before that, asylum attendants across the country had had their wages cut and were forced to work longer hours because of the financial crisis that the asylums found themselves in. And we haven't got time to go into it, but it prompted probably the most extraordinary industrial action that ever took place in this country, when a group of nurses barricaded themselves onto the wards to stop the wards being closed and the attendants being sacked, supported by the patients, who fought off an army of police and bailiffs for 15 hours, but that's another story. Asylum attendants were generally chosen for their size and their strength initially. They'd sleep in rooms adjacent to the ward because there were no night staff, so if anything happened at night, they'd have to get up and go and find out what's happening. They'd get 1 day off a month. The financial penalties for escapes, loss of keys and other rules infringements were severe. And they could only marry with the permission of the medical superintendent. These are the reasons why very often they would leave the job. They formed more radical trade unions than their general nursing counterparts, but in the secure hospitals, Broadmoor and the others, the staff actually graduated into the Prison Officers Association. So the militarisation that Jade referred to was very much linked to the attendants and the nurses' allegiance and alliance with prison officers. Beyond them, there were huge innovations happening in nursing. So in 1860, Florence Nightingale set up the first training school, St Thomas's Hospital. This was replicated by training schools up and down the country, but not in any of the asylums. Nurse reformers weren't interested in what was happening in the asylums because they were still hidden away and left behind. There was no progress in mental health until 1885, and Jade made reference to what was known as the Red Book, this handbook for the instruction of attendants, which was written by doctors. So it was a doctor's perspective on what attendants should be doing, not written by nurses or attendants, whereas the curriculum for general nurses was devised, written and implemented by nurses. Training came in 1891, but it wasn't until 1899 that it was extended to 2 years. So you can see nurses working in mental health were nearly 40 years behind their counterparts in general nursing. In 1919, when the Nurses Registration Act came into law, mental health nursing joined, but the general nursing community refused to have them on the same register. So they had to be on a separate register. So you had state registered nurses and registered mental nurses. And it's remained the same ever since. And that's a very important distinction. One of the other reasons that asylum attendants formed their own trade unions was that the nursing organisations, including the College of Nursing, the forerunner of the Royal College of Nursing, and the Royal British Nursing Association, refused to have them. So behind every great doctor, I mentioned moral treatment. Philippe Pinel is famous for what we see in this painting, unchaining the lunatics in Paris. In fact, it wasn't Philippe Pinel who unchained the lunatics in Paris. It was a man called Jean-Baptiste Poussin, an attendant, whom Pinel acknowledged he learnt most of his skills from. And Poussin was working in a separate hospital and unchained the Paris lunatics after Pinel had gone. Pinel then brought Poussin to his hospital in Paris, where they did the same thing. But Poussin was completely written out of history. Pinel, an extremely famous character in the history of psychiatry. This is a long story, but essentially what you have here is Pinel, who always acknowledged the importance of Jean-Baptiste Poussin, describes how essentially what his asylum attendant was doing was what we would now call cognitive behavioural therapy with a patient, very successfully. And it was just one example of the practice of this man. I mentioned the retreat, famous for the moral treatment that they devised and brought to England. And Samuel Tuke, whose painting you see here, is always associated with it. Very, very few people would know about George Jepson, who was the head attendant at the retreat. And again, Tuke acknowledged he learnt most of his skills and all that he knew about psychiatry from George Jepson. There's a lengthy description of Jepson here, which I won't go into, but if anybody wants these slides, just approach me afterwards and I'll make sure you can get them. So I mentioned secure settings and nurses. We've got the high secure hospitals that Jade made mention to. There are also 8 high secure prisons in this country. Nobody actually knows how many prisons there are at the moment. You'll see some counts of 119, some of 121, some of 120. God knows how you lose a prison or create one, but that's the state we're in as a country, I guess. One of the things about them is that they have no specific educational programs. for the nurses working in there, who are working in highly specialist areas with the most severely needing, patients with the most severe needs of any in the country, really. There used to be post-registration forensic courses, most of which have been shut down now. As with in secure hospitals, nurses have got this extraordinary role of having to balance being the custodian, essentially a prison officer, with the role of carer and everything that goes with that. In prisons, nurses don't have that dilemma, but they have to try and work within the constructs and the limitations of a prison regime, and having access to prisoners can be extremely difficult. I was working in Wandsworth Prison today, and probably the most disturbed person who needed to be seen could only be talked to through a small little hole in his door with no confidentiality, no privacy, and really very little opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with him. They nurse a client group who've got no public traction, no political power. They're a tiny minority in a shrinking workforce, because we're losing mental health nurses at an extraordinary rate, and the projection for the next 10 years is even worse. And there's no regional or even no national or even regional coordinated policy framework for this work. And how we got here is a long, hard road. 1774, a doctor called John Howard pressed for prison reform, and he wanted medical practitioners and nurses or attendants to come into prisons. He was successful in getting doctors in, but not nurses. Around 1850, there was a full medical service established in the prisons across the whole of the country. In 1919, we had the first trained nurses who went into Holloway, largely as a result of the work of Elizabeth Fry and other reformers. And they established a school of nursing there, which was the first place where nurses were taught to work in prisons. But that very quickly was lost, and what we had were what were called hospital officers. These were prison officers who received a very limited training and worked effectively as nurses within the prison service. So 6 months, and that was it. In 1996, the notion of equivalence was brought in, so that in theory, every prisoner will receive the equivalent health care that somebody in the community will receive. And that's something that each healthcare provider in a prison is expected to achieve. And in 2006, as late as 2006, the Ministry of Justice relinquished responsibility for healthcare in prisons, and it was handed over to the Department of Health, so that they had complete control of it. And then in 2013, NHS England took over the commissioning of prison healthcare, including nursing. And no one's sure how many nurses work in prisons. Again, it's quite extraordinary, really, when you think about it, that nobody monitors or collates this information. It's estimated there's maybe 3,000, which would be 0.5% of the registered nursing workforce. A private company that run healthcare in more than this number now, probably around 50 prisons, they estimated that they had maybe 850 nurses working, and the notion, the importance of these numbers will become apparent in the next slide. Because you've got nurses working in absolutely appalling conditions, the appalling conditions that people with severe mental illness have to live in. Jade made great play and really emphasised the notion that drove Broadmoor in its early years. You've now got severely mentally ill men living in rat-infested accommodation with toilets that are not fit to sit on, with filth on the walls, with poor food, very little exercise, very little exposure to daylight, the complete antithesis of the notion we started with Broadmoor. They're struggling to deliver within the confines of this prison regime. They're grossly underfunded, because if you'd have maybe one mental health nurse to 150 to 200 prisoners. The percentage of people with mental disorders, personality disorders or substance misuse is somewhere between 80 and 90% of the prison population in virtually every prison in the country. So you can imagine what the demand is for the nurses who work there and the psychiatrists who work there. It's also the only part of the healthcare in this country now which gets put out to competitive tendering every 5 years. So you're just about getting yourself sorted, you're just about finding how to make your systems work most effectively, and you then face the possibility that you're going to be taken over by another employer with another set of rules, another set of policies, another way of working. And the instability that that creates for this workforce is extraordinary. And no wonder they have significant problems with recruitment and retention. And they're still hidden away. Thank you.
Thank you both, Chris and Jade. Listening to both of the speakers this evening, like I said, I've been a nurse for about 20-something years, and interestingly, I started my working career as a prison officer before training as a nurse. And I was saying to the guys before, when I left the prison service, I vowed never to set foot in another prison after that, but then spent subsequent 20-something years working in various prisons. It's interesting how, from my perspective anyway, how no matter how much time has passed, how there have been things that have changed, but interestingly, there have been so many things that haven't. I think it's quite interesting that the sort of gender role identification process and the system of female staff being managed only by the female matron. I think that's quite interesting, and you know, the complete opposite to what you would see today. But I wonder what, or rather, if there are any other reflections that anybody else has, or any questions that you wanted to raise.